Hello, everyone. Our guest today is Uriel Epshtein, the executive director of the American nonprofit organization Renew Democracy Initiative. Nice to see you, Uriel, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, our conversation today will focus on the early days of Donald Trump's new presidency and on Trump's ability to achieve his goal as a peacemaker. Well, Donald Trump, yesterday and today, in his early days of presidency, stated that Putin must make a deal to achieve peace in Ukraine. And Trump also emphasizes that Putin is destroying Russia right now, that the country's economy is in a very poor condition. What does such rhetoric from Trump mean for you? And does he see Putin as an equal leader, I would say, or does he intend to pressure him instead?
Well, I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. I think you can see someone as an equal leader and still want to pressure them. And so in this case, I think Donald Trump does, in fact, see Vladimir Putin as someone who is his equal. In fact, I think there's evidence to say that Donald Trump in some ways admires Putin and in other ways perhaps is even jealous of him in some way. Ultimately, I was surprised by his remarks the other day. I had not expected him to be, again, just to say that even those remarks were not particularly negative, but they were certainly more direct and more negative than anything Donald Trump has said previously. So I'll be very curious to see how those remarks translate into actual action, because I remember how in Trump's first term in Helsinki, he stood next to Putin and agreed with him when Putin said that he had not intervened in American elections, despite the fact that every single one of America's intelligence agencies said that he did. So essentially, Trump trusted Vladimir Putin over America's own intelligence agencies. Now, obviously, there has been a fair bit of time since then, and so perhaps Trump's views have evolved. But certainly, I think the words that he used yesterday with respect to Putin ruining Russia, with respect to Russia's economy being fragile and weak, and Putin's refusal to accept a deal being incredibly problematic for him, while simultaneously being willing to say that the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, is in fact willing to accept a deal. Those were, again, I would say probably the most positive remarks Trump has made so far with regards to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Definitely, I think so either. And Trump he increases the level of Russian losses on the battlefield. He says that Russia had already lost almost 1 million soldiers. It's even more than we can hear from intelligence sources. So why does he picks such approach to press on Putin to make this pressure? What result he is expecting from this kind of dialogue?
Well, as we know, that Trump never talks about anything halfway, right? So if he's going to say something, if he's going to make a claim, he will exaggerate. That is the nature of Donald Trump. With respect to what his goals are, I don't think it's especially clear. I do think ultimately Trump fancies himself a deal maker. And when you're making a deal with someone as intransigent as I don't want to say irrational, because I actually think Putin is rational, but someone, quite frankly, as evil, as difficult as Vladimir Putin, you are by definition going to have to put pressure on them. And so I think Trump sees himself in this instance as putting pressure on Vladimir Putin. The question that I think we should be asking is, how far is he willing to go with this pressure? Because we saw that President Biden was willing to say much more aggressive things, right? I mean, he called Putin a murderer. He spoke out unequivocally in defense of Ukraine and unequivocally against Russia. But then when it came time to actually act, he proved that he was unwilling or unable to take these strong, powerful actions that were necessary in order to push Russia back and ensure that Ukraine had everything it needed to win this war. Now, meanwhile, with Donald Trump, we have seen him being unwilling to say the same things that Joe Biden has said, right? President Trump is unwilling to say that Putin is a murderer. He's not going to be as direct as Biden was. But now, what remains to be seen is how aggressive will his actions be, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, Trump is not a particularly predictable character. And so here, that could be an opportunity in his favor, right? Where I think everyone kind of expects him to be softer on Putin. But if he comes out of the gate swinging and wants to show the world that he is, again, unpredictable, that he's strong, and that, even someone like Putin ultimately has to retreat under Donald Trump's ferocious negotiating prowess, that could actually be a positive development. So again, I think it's unclear. I think ultimately we shall see who within Trump's administration will have the greatest power as it relates to the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. So if Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, if Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, if they're the ones who have power, then I think we might actually see an American policy that is stronger than most people expected, and is willing to oppose and push back on Putin. But if, however, the power rests with people like Elon Musk or Tulsi Gabbard, the incoming Director of National Intelligence, then I think we will very well see a very different policy.
So we're standing on some kind of crossroad right now. Well, President Trump also mentioned the possible implementation of new sanctions against Russia. What might these sanctions be? What might these sanctions entail?
Well, look, I mean, we unfortunately have seen that American sanctions on Russia resemble Swiss cheese, right? With some holes that are big enough for trucks or, perhaps to continue the metaphor, tankers, Russian oil tankers to pass through. So, I think Biden in his final days before leaving office imposed, truly powerful sanctions that prevented the so-called shadow fleet, which is, about just under 200 Russian tankers from being able to operate worldwide. And these are ships that, had not essentially been registered appropriately, and so were able to slip through previous sanctions. And, I do think that this was a not minor hit against Russia's oil economy. And so if Trump is willing to go even further, and again, further tighten sanctions regarding oil, if he's willing to implement perhaps even secondary sanctions, which is to say those sanctions which target countries which are trying to get around American sanctions on Russia. So that's one of the most effective ways that Russia's been able to evade our previous sanctions, is basically where they might previously have gotten goods directly from the U.S. Now they'll get those same goods just through a third-party country like Kazakhstan, or Azerbaijan or whatever, right? And so the more that we limit Russia's ability to do so, the more we limit its ability to continue this war. But right now, by we, I mean the collective West, are not in a very strong position. But we have an opportunity to strengthen that position. It truly boggles my mind a little bit that on the one hand, we are willing to support Ukraine ultimately, right, and give billions of dollars in aid, military and humanitarian and budgetary. But at the same time, we are also willing to continue trading with Russia to the tune of billions of dollars. So with the left hand, we help Ukraine, and with the right hand, we help the aggressor. That is a recipe for disaster. And we have to recognize that, and we have to be willing to incur some short-term trade costs in order to ultimately save money in the long term. Because the more money, the more opportunity we provide Putin to continue funding this war, the more ultimately Ukrainians will die. The more Western military aid will have to be sent, the more Western humanitarian aid will have to be sent, the more refugees will end up coming from Ukraine into Europe and beyond. And these are the exact things that not only Donald Trump, but other European leaders, including those leaders on the right who, will sometimes align with Vladimir Putin, that's in their interest, right? It's in their interest to ultimately be spending less money on this conflict and to have to deal deal with fewer refugees. But the only way to ensure that this happens is by continuing to tighten those sanctions on Russia. So again, whether or not Trump actually implements tougher sanctions, I think remains to be seen. We'll see if he tries to walk back any of the sanctions that Joe Biden implemented, although I don't think that will be easy because I think a number of them will actually require congressional intervention. So, we'll see what Trump's willingness is. And again, if he is willing, then there are significant sanctions that the American president could implement. And I would say the first one that Donald Trump could do with the stroke of his pen is to confiscate the $5 billion in Russian assets that exist right now in the U.S. and give them to Ukraine. This has been something that my organization, the Renewed Democracy Initiative, has advocated for the last 2 to 3 years, and yet it has never been done. President Biden hasn't done it, even though he has spoken favorably about it. And so I think that if Donald Trump wanted to demonstrate his strength, that could be a very first powerful step that he could take alone.
And that could be definitely very painful for Kremlin and Putin's fellows. Well, Uriel, I also like to talk a little bit about Kit Kellogg's mission, the special envoy for the war in Ukraine from the President Trump. So the Wall Street Journal reports that Donald Trump has instructed the special envoy for the war in Ukraine, Kit Kellogg, to end the Russo-Ukrainian conflict within 100 days. Actually, however, Kellogg has never worked as a diplomat, so he probably won't be involved in any real negotiations with Russia. And I also will quote the Wall Street Journal in this place. Kellogg, like some of the Trump's other special envoys, was appointed despite his lack of relevant experience, according to the publication of the Wall Street Journal. So what will be General Kellogg's role in the negotiations with Russia? What does the 100-day deadline means? What does it mean for finding a path to peace in Ukraine?
You know, we appear to have moved significantly beyond the original deadline, which Donald Trump promised during his campaign.
24 hours, yeah.
So 100 days, 24 hours, those are different numbers.
Pretty close.
That's right. So we've only changed 100x. As for what that actually means in practice, in truth, not much. Right. Setting these arbitrary deadlines on, end this by this date or whatever, it's meaningless. And if we actually want to ensure that Western interests, that the interests of the free world, that American interests are protected, then we have to be willing to do whatever it takes. It is not our decision, ultimately, when this war ends. At the end of the day, either it'll be up to whatever happens on the battlefield, or it'll be up to Putin as the aggressor, right? When Putin is willing to start pulling back and is willing to start going back to Russian borders, that's when the war can come to a conclusion, but not before. And saying that we will do whatever it takes to end this war by a certain deadline is a mistake, because what it signals to the enemy is that we are willing to retreat, that we are willing to make big sacrifices, big compromises in order to end this thing. I mean, and again, in any negotiation, right? Like if you go in and you want to buy a new apartment and you go in with the sort of expectation, like I will buy this apartment no matter what, then you can expect to pay a lot more money. And, Donald Trump fancies himself this incredibly effective businessman. He should know that. Right. I mean, and so this is a negotiation ultimately along those same lines. So if he is signaling to the other party that we are willing to end this thing no matter what, then that other party will have a much more powerful negotiating position. So if Trump truly wants to end this sooner, what he needs to do is convince Vladimir Putin that, in fact, we are not going anywhere. That we are actually going to remain, that we are going to ensure that Ukrainians' negotiating position is going to ultimately improve and is going to improve over time, which will in turn force Putin to actually come to the negotiating table. Because if you're Vladimir Putin right now, you do not have that much motivation to negotiate. Why should you? You think you're winning this war. So again, the 100 days I don't take particularly seriously. As for what Keith Kellogg's role will be, I mean, look, yes, he's never been a diplomat, but I would say unlike some of Trump's previous diplomats, he actually does have some relevant experience in the form of his military background. I'll remind you that Jared Kushner was involved in negotiating Middle East peace deals, despite having absolutely zero relevant experience. That Donald Trump's previous ambassador to Israel's ambassador David Friedman, who was also obviously in charge of negotiating despite having no diplomatic experience. And again, I actually must offer credit where credit is due. Jared Kushner and Friedman were fairly successful, right? They ultimately got the Abraham Accords, which made peace with a number of Middle Eastern countries. So, again, does Keith Kellogg have significant relevant diplomatic experience? No, as the Wall Street Journal pointed out. I don't think, though, that will ultimately change his role. I actually do think that Kellogg will be involved in negotiations because we've seen that this administration does not actually trust the kind of professional diplomatic service, the foreign service of the United States, which means that I actually think Kellogg will have a greater role than people expect rather than a smaller one.
We definitely wish Kit Kellogg good luck and success in his mission. Speaking apart of Kit Kellogg, about Donald Trump's nominees, how successfully right now are the Senate hearings preceding Donald Trump's nominees to key government positions? We already know that Marco Rubio has been already confirmed and supported by votes in the Senate. But will Senate confirm Pete Hegseth as the nominee for the Secretary of Defense?
Well, I speak for myself when I say that I certainly hope not. But we shall see. So Pete Hegseth's nomination has run into significant trouble, as you know. Just the other day, there were new revelations that his former sister-in-law came out and said that he abused his ex-wife. And that in fact, she had a safe word where if he got too drunk and was too threatening, she would text her the safe word in order for her to come and try to get the ex-wife out of the situation, whatever it was. Now, if this were any American soldier, right? Any American soldier would be pushed out of the service because of this, right? They would be discharged. It doesn't matter the rank, right? Whether they're enlisted, whether they're an officer. I mean, there is no world in which a colonel or a general could remain in the service after multiple allegations of this nature surface. Because again, the allegations of this former sister-in-law are not the first. There have been allegations across the board of his drinking to excess, of him being drunk in public, of him being passed out drunk, of him doing foolish things because of his inebriation. And even his own mother sent him an email where she described how he would treat women incredibly poorly. So again, all of this would be disqualifying in any other circumstance in the American military. So presumably, the U.S. Defense Secretary needs to be held to the same standard that any American soldier, any American colonel or general or, anyone else in the American military would be held to, regardless of political ideology, political party, etc.
Okay, so according to the U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, the United States will work hard to ensure that Vladimir Putin does not start a new war in the next few years after the truce and this peace will be confirmed. So what steps actually the United States can and must take to prevent such a scenario? And because definitely Putin will be insisting on his demands and his conditions in this so-called peace negotiations.
NATO. That's it. I mean, there's ultimately the only solution, the only way to ensure that Putin does not invade Ukraine again or does not try to invade one of his other neighbors is to negotiate in position from strength. That is it. There's no other way. And so for those who say that, inviting Ukraine to NATO is a provocation, I would ask them, has Putin actually invaded any NATO country? The answer is no. NATO is not a provocation. It is a security guarantee. It is a defensive alliance, not an offensive one. So if we want to guarantee Ukraine's security, if we want to prevent future war, then the way to do so is bring Ukraine into NATO. In fact, the reason Putin invaded in the first place was because Ukraine was not in NATO. Right? That's how he felt safe to invade, because he thought, based on his past experience, that the West would do nothing. And he had good reason to believe that, right? He had good reason to think that we would sit back and watch as he took over Ukraine. Because, there's a history of, quite frankly, of us doing that. Starting with his, bombing Grozny into the dust in 2000, him invading Georgia in 2008, his first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, his bombing Aleppo and other places in Syria into the dust in 2015, sending troops into Belarus in order to put down the protests in 2020, sending troops into Kazakhstan in order to put down the protests there in 2021. In each of these places, Putin advanced Russian interests through military means, and the West responded by sitting on its hands. So he had every reason to think we would do the same thing in 2022. Thankfully, we did not. But in order for us to ensure that we can deter Putin in the future, we have to offer Ukraine security guarantees. The simplest way to do so would simply be to offer Ukraine a path into NATO. Now, if ultimately Donald Trump is unwilling to do that, then the alternative options would probably include some form of bilateral or multilateral security guarantees with Ukraine. Now, again, the problem with these security guarantees is those are the similar guarantees to what we offered in 1994, when we essentially pressured Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons and return them to Russia. We offered Ukraine security guarantees then. And here, by the way, I should say that it's not just the West, it's also Russia. Russia offered Ukraine security guarantees in 1994. And, of course, we've learned how much their words are worth. So again, if we are to offer Ukraine security guarantees this time around, they have to be done in a way that is credible and consistent, that where it won't change with political winds. So whether that's peacekeepers on Ukraine's border or something else, the only way to guarantee that Putin does not invade again, does not continue this war in 3, 4, 5 years, is to ensure that he knows that the West won't just respond, but that the West is actually set up to deter his forces in a way that is compelling.
Fine, let's dedicate some time of our conversation to China topic and American-Chinese relationship. Can we see that Donald Trump's position on China is changing a little bit? Previously he spoke about imposing high tariffs on Chinese goods and economy, but right now the discussion is focused, I would say, only on 10% tariffs, so it's much lower than the previous numbers. Why has this changed, and what does that mean?
I would compare Donald Trump on China to a dog with a very loud bark and a very weak bite. In truth, I haven't seen evidence in quite frankly in a few years of that Donald Trump would actually be very harsh on China. Now, look, there's still a chance that he may be, but the thing that strikes me isn't just his changing tariff numbers, although that's somewhat concerning. But ultimately, I wish Joe Biden had been much firmer and had implemented harsher sanctions on China for any number of things. But no, the thing that is most concerning to me is the fact that Donald Trump appears willing to protect TikTok. TikTok was an app that he actually tried to ban in his first term as president, and appropriately so. Ultimately, he did not have the constitutional authority to unilaterally ban an app like that, but Congress does have that authority. And so now that Congress has passed a law banning TikTok, the fact that Donald Trump is suddenly willing to do a complete 180 and defend TikTok is a real problem. And it's a problem for two reasons. One, because TikTok TikTok can steal the data of Americans and provide it to China's government. But in my view, that's actually not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem with TikTok is that they are a government-sponsored, for all intents and purposes, intelligence operation whose goal it is to get into every single American household and be well positioned to influence the American citizens by means of propaganda and essentially trying to sow disinformation, discord, and division among the American public. Now, the challenge here is that China doesn't have to be doing that right now in order to be setting itself up for the ability to do that later, right? So essentially, if you get into 170 million households, which, by the way, is roughly how many households have someone who looks at TikTok in the United States, once you are in those households, once you have those eyeballs, you can then show them whatever you want. And so even if today they don't show them these things, that doesn't mean that tomorrow they won't. And we should not be giving an adversary that kind of power over the minds of our people without some sort of limitations. Now, again, we have freedom of speech in the U.S., and that should be sacrosanct. But, freedom of speech does not mean that we offer foreign intelligence operations free reign on American territory, right? It's one thing for Elon Musk and Twitter to operate however it wants, right? Elon Musk is ultimately an American citizen and Twitter is an American company. And so freedom of speech absolutely applies here. TikTok, however, is not an American company, and it is not simply a foreign company. It is, for all intents and purposes, a Chinese Communist Party owned and operated company, which means that they are almost certainly connected to the Chinese intelligence. And that in turn means that we have every right to push back on them, as has been now confirmed by the United States Supreme Court, which ruled 9-0 in defense of the TikTok ban. So anyway, I go through all of this because what concerns me about Trump's relationship with China is that he doesn't appear willing to do the things that will actually significantly impact China's ability to exert influence abroad, especially within the United States. Now, we'll see how this evolves. We have seen within the Republican Party those who have expressed a much firmer and more consistent anti-Chinese Communist Party line. I'll note that in particular, Senator Tom Cotton, has come out and said that TikTok absolutely should be banned, and that Trump, as the leader of the executive branch, must implement the will of Congress in banning TikTok. So we'll see whether or not that changes. Now, the things that I'm looking out for with respect to Trump's relationship with China is, one, whether or not, what happens with TikTok. Two, what happens with tariffs, right? I mean, I would be very concerned if Trump implements higher tariffs on allies like Denmark, Canada, or Mexico instead of adversaries like China. Three, whether or not Trump meets with Xi Jinping directly, and whether or not Trump communicates any concerns over Chinese actions in the South China Sea, Chinese actions with respect to supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or with respect to the genocide of the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province. Now, if he is willing to pressure Xi Jinping on any of those issues, that would be, I think, a powerful statement. But if he's willing instead to ignore those issues in favor of focusing exclusively on questions of business or things like that, obviously that would be a concern. So again, I'm sure we'll learn more in the next few weeks or months. But I think those are sort of the key points of the Trump-China relationship that we have to be looking out for. And I should note, my goodness, I forgot the biggest point is Taiwan. Definitely. Is Trump going to be willing to defend Taiwan if China ultimately decides to invade? And that's something that, on the one hand, we are legally obligated to do. But on the other hand, I'll be honest that I've heard some concerning statements here and there from some people in Trump's orbit. So again, Trump has in the past spoken out aggressively on this issue. So I just hope that he stands by those words that he himself has put out there.
Taiwan is very important. And one more word about TikTok. So if Elon Musk or any other tycoon or corporation or company, American company, buys a half of TikTok or even more, it will not solve the problem with TikTok itself, as I understand.
Correct. By law, according to the law that Congress passed, it is unambiguous. TikTok has has to be sold in full or at minimum 80%. A 50-50 partnership will not suffice. It will not meet the requirements of this law. And so so Trump has extended TikTok's life by about 75 days right now in order to try to find some kind of deal. But again, I just don't see an opportunity. I just don't see a way for him to find a deal that simultaneously fulfills the requirements of this law and fulfills Chinese demands. Right. I just don't think there's a way to balance that. So the only way that TikTok will ultimately survive is if Congress is willing to roll over and either change the law somehow or essentially make a legislative change. But on the executive side, Trump has, as of now, presumably no choice but to enforce the law that Congress has passed.
Uriel, and the last question today in our today's conversation is about an oil and economy. What are the prospects for increasing oil production as Trump promised actually during his inauguration speech? In the United States, is the United States ready to significantly ramp up oil production? How will this affect the global markets and Russia's ability to finance the war?
I hope so. But yes, I do believe, I mean, this is an area in which Donald Trump has actually been fairly consistent, as has the Republican Party, to their credit. I mean, some of the slogans have been fairly simplistic, right? Drill, baby, drill, and things like that. But the flip side is, you know what? Yeah, go ahead. It's logical. I've always had a problem with elements which would say, like, look, we should not be allowing new oil drilling, et cetera, because those same people who say that we're not going to allow new drilling for oil are the same people who will then advocate on behalf of easing sanctions on Venezuelan oil or Iranian oil, et cetera. And so, is the understanding that somehow the oil of dictators is going to be cleaner, greener, better than oil produced, drilled in free countries like the U.S.? Ultimately, the only way to address the climate crisis and to address our reliance upon oil isn't on the supply side. It's on the demand side. Right? If we offer other sources of energy, if we change our demand for oil, that will in turn change incentives for whether or not to drill for oil. But so long as those alternatives do not yet exist, and so long as we need oil in order to do whatever it is we're doing, then we are infinitely better off getting that oil from the free world. And so if the U.S. is able to significantly increase its production of oil, that will be good on the global stage because it will decrease the power and influence of countries like Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. And I think that's absolutely critical, and that's in everyone's interest. And then if within the next decade we are ultimately able to develop additional alternatives to oil, and I would note that nuclear energy should be top of the list, then that would be great. And then we can start transitioning. But you can't transition to something if it's not there. And right now, those alternatives simply do not exist or do not exist in sufficient quantities for us to be able to replace oil. So I think that those who say that, we shouldn't be developing or drilling for oil in the United States or in other free countries, that those people are making a big mistake. Because what happens then is we are essentially giving away, a lot of power to some incredibly dangerous and authoritarian leaders.
Thank you so much, Uriel, and thank you, dear friends, for your attention. Please subscribe our channel and write your comments below the video. It's always a pleasure for us to read your opinions. Uriel, thank you once again, and hope to see you soon on our channel again, anytime soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.